welcome to the panel, what Silicon Valley got to do with it. And it's a big question, and I would like to get some answer as well. As far as I can tell, as a regional economist, no one can be compared to Silicon Valley. And we have five experts who actually want to destroy the topic a little bit, only a little bit, and say, yeah, indeed, things can be done outside the Valley. So we have these five aspiring investors and market practitioners to give us a hint or maybe factors on why opportunity do exist outside of the Valley. So sitting next to my right is Alec Allison. Next to him is Andrew Auerbach, and the gentleman on my far right is Eric Drummond. And sitting to my left is Kate Mitchell, and next to her will be John Raffolo. So for more detail about what they do, I think you would like to read into what they do. Right after the panel, please go to our websites and you can get certainly more information. And maybe you can debate with them whether their statements are correct or not. Silicon Valley is often synonymous with leadership in technology, entrepreneurship, intense technology clustering, and venture investments. Also, I think to investors, it is a place where investment can be best leveraged and reap the big benefit or return. And to entrepreneur, it is the regions that you can build the most value enterprise. So that's a brand name if you're in the Valley, so to speak, you approve or you approve. So either case, that would be the place to be. And to a firm, really is a place that you can build the products that can command consumer attention and also, I think, command the marketplace in that rank. I think to me, I think the last reason is most important, is to the government and civic leaders. Silicon Valley is almost an equivalent to how you build a regional economy that can be sustained, and create prosperities that going through economic cycles. So those are the things that I think we care the most about. And can we have slide number 3, please? Okay, so part of, or all of it, the characteristic of the Silicon Valley has been cloned somewhere, and sometime can be quite successful. And today, we are going to just elaborate on those topics and see if indeed can the Silicon Valley be cloned or exist outside the Silicon Valley. So I'm going to throw off the first question to Eric, and then after that, all of us can jump in. If indeed it's that easy, quote unquote, over time, to learn the best practice on Earth to combine capital, technology, and entrepreneurship in a region. My question is, how come Los Angeles is not quite much on the map compared to the Valley? Maybe you can actually give a hint or two.
Well, here's my perception. Having worked in Silicon Valley, Austin, and now the last 10 years in Colorado and Denver, Boulder, areas like that. In order to create the right kind of ecosystem, you have to identify the assets that best support the innovative and entrepreneurial ethos that you want to build. You have to identify the assets. You have to bring in the right kind of stakeholders. You have to match it with capital. It has to be the right kind of capital at the right time. And then you have to be able to build a mentor and management system around that in order to take startups and entrepreneurs from idea to formation to growth and this scale. And there may be a sense in which Los Angeles hasn't quite formed its around its assets and brought the stakeholders around those in the way that we did, certainly have in Silicon Valley, but the way we've done it in Austin and the way we've done it in Colorado.
Alec.
Yeah, I'll chime in as well. I think what prompted the question a little bit about LA was during lunch hearing Mayor Garcetti speak about unbelievably the assets that LA brings to the table. 250 languages, obviously the same tax rates Silicon Valley. Immigration, he said 3 of the top 25 research universities in the country were in the LA metro area, more than Silicon Valley, frankly. And what I would contend is that one thing Silicon Valley really has that is distinct is the managerial ecosystem. Actually, if I can use a couple of slides maybe to highlight the point. Can you bring up slide 17? So this looks at 14 regions in the country by the amount of venture capital investment. And you see Silicon Valley exceeds the entire East Coast, and you see LA being a fraction there. Go to the next slide, 18. But when it comes to IPOs, and this is TMT, Tech, Media, and Telecom, you see a greater concentration, actually, in Silicon Valley. In my experience, and I think I've traveled in my career to 39 different states to visit tech companies. You can start a software company or internet company anywhere. What Silicon Valley has that is distinct is really highlighted by this point, is the managerial ecosystem that can take you to public offering and beyond. Hard to replicate, but certainly can be built.
Well, I think we're talking, there are different levels of innovation, right? There's capital I innovation, the big idea, the game changer. And then there's the little I, the cost-effective software-based solution that can quickly deliver cost efficiencies to a company or a system. And one of the things that we look at Cambridge Associates is you have venture capital seed stage company financings, which speaks to the slides that Alec just walked through, I apologize. But then you also have growth equity. And growth equity is actually groups of folks that come together to build companies without any support from venture capital. And they get to revenue and profitability without anybody's help whatsoever. And those can exist anywhere around the country. And while a lot of the information we have on the slides that we'll be whipping through for you guys today is much more about venture capital, there's a whole other level of capital called growth equity, which is really supporting maybe more little I than big I innovation going on around the country in different metro centers.
I can talk a little bit about I do work in Silicon Valley. In fact, my grandfather started at Ames Research Center at Moffett Field. He came from Virginia out to Silicon Valley and he ran all of instrumentation. He thought it was crazy. He said the only reason you put people in rockets is to sell it in Congress. It's easier to do without the people. So that tells you his perspective on technology. And so I've watched it develop my whole life, graduated from Stanford. I'm a venture capitalist and invest in early high growth sort of innovative companies. And I was also chairman of the National Venture Capital Association and spent a lot of time across the US and internationally talking to people about how do you replicate what we have there here. In fact, I've worked a lot. I'll call out somebody in the audience, Steve Case, a successful entrepreneur himself, and also founder of Startup America. And I've spent some time with that group trying to get and to stimulate some growth elsewhere. And I'll give you some perspective on because we've seen companies started in the Valley and they've been successful. We've seen companies ex-Silicon Valley do quite well. We've seen many start elsewhere and move to Silicon Valley. So we've seen sort of all the above. And there are a couple things that I think are attractive being in Silicon Valley for startups and why they're here. And Alec, you touched on one of them, which is managerial talent. I think it goes more broadly than that. I think it's the right contents, the right skill set. Typically that's engineering if you're talking about hardcore IT, but it could be for something like ag tech, it could be something that's in St. Louis. For something like telecommunications, it could be Canada. For something like fintech, it could be London. So it doesn't need to be in Silicon Valley, and I would argue for those other skills, there are better skills outside Silicon Valley than here. The other things that matter a lot are not just managerial talent, but sales and marketing talent. That's really important, how you grow a company. That's one of the reasons a lot of companies start in Israel, as an example, but when they want to grow, come to Silicon Valley, often the US, to grow because of the sales and marketing expertise and that understanding of how you scale technology over time. The other reason people come to Silicon Valley is for business development reasons. Almost all of these companies partner with other people. Well, they're all down the road. They're all at the same coffee shop. So that's one of the reasons that people are in Silicon Valley. I also think it's broadly the ecosystem. And that is capital, sources of capital. It's other entrepreneurs. So you can sit in a room this size and brainstorm about what did you learn, how did you pitch, how did you raise money. I want to give you my pitch so you can critique my own when I go to ask, just as you have successfully done it. It's where you can find mentors. We're co-investors with Steve in a company called Everyday Health that went public, having, in the case of Steve, the ex-founder of a very successful large company, AOL, as around the hoop for brand new entrepreneurs that haven't built a company before. That kind of mentorship is incredibly valuable.
It's based in New York.
It's based. Well, no, that's going to be my bottom line. That's going to be my bottom line? Is though I don't think. Well, I think Silicon Valley has those things. I don't think it's necessarily owned by Silicon Valley. We are only investors in the U.S., and John will cover ex-U.S. As a board member of Silicon Valley Bank, we're very interested in things outside the U.S. But we have 5 what's called in Silicon Valley unicorns. And unicorns are companies worth over $1 billion right now in our portfolio. 3 of them are outside Silicon Valley: Provo, Utah, Indianapolis, and Seattle. So it's absolutely possible. And we like getting out of Silicon Valley because there's a trade-off, and it's not so much about taxes. These companies aren't worried about paying taxes because they don't make income yet. It's more about, can you find the same ecosystem? Can you find a good set of stable engineers? And I'll tell you later, we can circle back on why I think those other areas are gaining, but partly because they're very stable workforces. You don't have to worry about them going down the street to WhatsApp and Facebook and other places like that. So I really think it's valuable, but I think it's also important that those that are trying to build ecosystems outside Silicon Valley think about consciously building that ecosystem, the mentorship, and things like that. Later I can give an example of what they've done in Provo and why it's been so successful to work there. So those are kind of my 2 cents as a foundational aspect.
That was a great lead-in, given that I'm the only non-American on this panel, and give you the non-U.S. centric view. And being an Italian, living in Canada, married to a South Korean, I'll cover the rest of the world.
Wow, you got it nailed.
Yes.
Captured that.
And, I'd start off, I actually don't care about replicating Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley has its own unique characteristics. What is actually really important is the connectivity into Silicon Valley, which is absolutely critical because a lot of the buyers ultimately of companies are there. Certain unique skill sets are there that are not found elsewhere in the world. But one of the things that we had done, and I represent, it's called OMERS Ventures. OMERS is one of Canada's largest pension funds, and we built out our own direct venture arm. We started investing exclusively in Canada, but we can invest anywhere in the world. And to me, one of the biggest things to identify is where are there the greatest mismatches of supply and demand of capital. The Silicon Valley is not a place to do that, and we knew that if we were to go there and compete head-on-head, we would get our head blown right off. But starting to look at other places, and certainly Canada is the place that we dominate, but looking in London, Berlin, Israel, China, some of the Asian countries, fascinating.
Latin America.
Yeah, right, and actually in the U.S., it's the places where the rest of the VCs are not really trying to go to. And there's fascinating opportunities, but perhaps not the same volume. So you have to be far more laser focused. But today with the less requirements for capital, with the connectivity around the world of resources, and the biggest thing I'd say that when we're identifying clusters around the world, looking at the engineering schools and looking to see where the engineering students are coming out. And when I was just in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, what's the big school where Google, Microsoft is? Tsingtao?
Tsinghua universities.
They graduate annually more than all engineers in the U.S. combined in that one school. And it's like you start to wonder, oh my God, the ideas that are going to come out of there. Now, the ecosystem is very, very immature. But trying to find places around the world where you start to see those glimmers of trades, I think that's where the capital is going to eventually get to.
Actually, you got to the point. Oh, I'm sorry.
Barry, if I could, I'd like to drill
Please.
down a little further. So one of the things you mentioned earlier was, can Silicon Valley be cloned in other places? And I want to differentiate that point. I don't know that we want to clone it. If we could pull up slide 10. So part of the reason why I have that sentiment is the perspective that I have in working in the innovative ecosystem. So I sit on the board of directors of our state's venture capital authority. I'm a partner in a law firm. I've been practicing for close to 25 years. I was at Patton Boggs, a large international firm, and I ran projects and helped develop projects all over the world that were energy and mostly capital intensive. So this slide here shows that of the 10 top regions for high-tech startup, number 1 is in Colorado, number 2 is in Colorado, number 6 is in Colorado, number 9 is in Colorado. This isn't my slide.
That's great.
Okay? This isn't my slide. So the reason why I think it's important to understand what Silicon Valley has done right, and then understand what can be done right in your region, is to figure out what's been done there, what does the capital look like, what does access to capital look like, barriers to entry, the management system, the ability to roll over senior management who has exited various startups and are now available to
Yes.
support. So in these other regions of the country, there are similarities to that, not cloned. They're operating under a rubric of how do we identify what assets we have, how do we match that with the appropriate kind of capital for the startups that we are looking to grow, and in Colorado it's often more capital intensive, it's less IT, although IT and software in Boulder. But it's advanced industries, for instance, in the clean tech realm. There's a different kind of capital that you need to support that. There's in the view of how that capital needs to gain returns and how long it can be deployed in the market before it has to come back out and satisfy investors. And so in these kinds of areas, I think it's really important. What do you have? It doesn't mean that you won't need to access capital coming out of Silicon Valley, because I think Cool Planet just left California and moved to Colorado this past summer. They raised about $29 million, and a substantial part of that, I think, was from Coastal Ventures and Kleiner Perkins and others out here on the West Coast. But what it does mean is helping them formulate a game plan from beginning to growth and exits that is best for the ecosystem and the assets in which you can deploy in your realm to help those people who want to start a business be an entrepreneur. And I think that's a really a little bit more robust picture of looking at how to move the ball forward where you are.
So it gets into a bit of, I think, if you look at the managerial aspect of it, does product and talents, do they have to make a match in that region that really make, I think, the process shine? I think one of the things we often think about, we can deal with a lot of things. Venture capital, we can set up similar structure, and we can look at some of the local governments or the locale's economic characteristic. But how do you really, before you go into region, how do you assess the culture in that region and look at the talent you can amass and make the best product out of it? So anyone want to go into by way of how you can see, you can place the money in that region and match up to the talents? Is it a difficult process? Apparently, that's a very difficult.
Yeah, I will give you a sense, partly because we look for investments and have had a great track record of success, as I've mentioned, outside of Silicon Valley. I'll tell you the biggest issue I see, and it's the toughest because the solution is not something out of the box. So I think there are a lot of good solutions around the things that Eric just spoke about, you know, taking advantage of local skills, getting people together, convening. There's so much you can do to build on what already might exist and grow a region. The biggest issue, and it's very fundamental, is the willingness to take risk, the willingness to accept failure. And that is one of the biggest impediments globally to success, because if you look at the numbers, most startups fail. It's tough. I mean, my family, my in-laws are from Michigan, and University of Michigan pumps out a ton of really wonderful IP. I've spent time at the business school there. They have a great global symposium, growth symposium every spring. Great entrepreneurs there. Not enough capital, but more importantly, it's tough to go home to your parents and you just got a job at Ford, and you have a job at this crazy startup, and your parents are like, why aren't you taking the job at Ford? And it is very difficult to move the dial. The chairman of Sony mentioned that at lunch, that one of the things they're trying to change in the Japanese culture is the acceptance of failure. And that is something that, as then the fathers of business, the mothers of business in different communities, I think we have to reinforce that understanding that, you know, experimentation and failure is part of success. When you look at the birth of a lot of companies, Twitter was a spinoff of a failed podcast company called Odeo. Sergey Brin and Larry Page tried to sell Google to Yahoo and felt like they had failed when they couldn't, and obviously have now developed a company that's much bigger than Yahoo and today more successful than Yahoo. So you have to be willing to understand, what it takes to go forward. My husband worked at Apple for many years, and the way he talked about being in Silicon Valley, if you hadn't lost your job, you kind of hadn't made it yet. You weren't there. Well, that's very different than most of us, where we're looking to keep our jobs. So I do think that adversarial economic times can be a real benefit for entrepreneurs. You see entrepreneurship flourish because guess what? They're not alternatives. So all of a sudden you go home to mom and say, I have either no job or a job where I kind of pay myself only a teeny tiny bit around my dorm room table, which is what happened to the founders of Omniture in Provo, Utah, and they kept themselves going by doing part-time work elsewhere to get their core business built. And then now they sold the company for almost $2 billion to Adobe. They now are on to other startups. They are now developed something called Silicon Slopes, where they help other entrepreneurs within Utah and the Silicon Valley area grow and learn. But it's that willingness to fail and that acceptance of that I think is really, really important.
I think one of the best indicators of a risk-taking culture is clusters of immigration.
Yes, good point.
We're a nation of immigrants, but there's certainly parts of the country where immigration is much stronger. New York, where I'm from, not grew up but live now, we see tremendous immigration culture and this willingness to take risks. The minute you leave where you're from, you are a risk taker. And it's not necessarily always from another country. You want to get a Boston venture capitalist upset, remind them that the guys who started Facebook had to leave Cambridge to go to Silicon Valley. It gets them very, very upset. My favorite immigration story to contrast the cultural point that Kate just made up is a company we sold for about $500 million to IBM several years ago, where the founder, who still owned over 20%, so can you do the math, over $100 million worth, Asian immigrant. He's a risk taker by nature. How many of you have seen the movie 21? He was one of the guys on which it's based, MIT engineer. And you never want to talk about that, but he's a gambler. And when the deal, by the way, the price of the deal was $21 a share, which was very coincidental. But when he called his mother the night before the deal was going to be announced and said, Mom, I sold the company, $500 million. What? You did what? I sold it to IBM. His mother said, you're just like your sister, you're going to lose your job. Because in her mind, a steady job was the value. By the way, he worked at IBM for a few years. Now he's at another venture capital firm as an entrepreneur in residence because he feels he has to do it again.
Great.
Well, I think right now in the current environment, there's definitely creeping up risk tolerance for being unemployed and trying to make a company into something that's substantial. I think we are seeing the emigration of folks from the Bay Area to other places where there's a lower cost of living, and they can make that dollar stretch, eat those ramen noodles a little longer, and make things work. And in fact, I spend time in Israel in the venture capital community there, and because the cost of living differential is that much better for entrepreneurs in Israel, they can really stretch out that seed round dollar even longer than what you could do in the Bay Area, judging by what the cost of housing is right now in San Francisco and on the peninsula. People need to make it work a little faster in Silicon Valley, probably, maybe than they have to do elsewhere.
And
So,
another nation of immigrants.
yes, yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah, good point.
I'm an immigrant. I never thought that I would jump off the boat and think that I would just take the risk without jobs tomorrow. Maybe I should try. but anyway, I think it is something that I think someone with the knowledge and determination, talents of some specific kind, that I think make this country great and certainly make the Silicon Valley shine. So actually, I would like to circle back to New York, actually, since you really enjoy New York a lot. The question is, when you talk about talents, financial talents, and certainly attached to the financial sectors, you do have a lot of IT experts in New York as well. How come New York never really make it to the map, so to speak, on technology in ICT, etc.? What's the reason for that? Is it because
It's growing. Right?
finance sector is too dominant? There's a question mark.
Yeah. Well, certainly it's changing, as Kate alluded to, and
Yeah.
Everyday Health, the company that she talked about that her firm just took public, is in Soho. But I think historically, Silicon Valley, look at the first word, silicon. It was the chip industry, which was the foundation. You know, the people have seen the charts that start off with Fairchild Semiconductor and all the companies that have been spawned through the generations from there. New York never had that basis, with the slight exception of IBM, which of course was all over New York City, upstate New York. And it spawned a lot of great managers, but not many different companies. But it's changing in New York, I think, with the advent of the internet. And New York has something that's very different than Silicon Valley that was a handicap in the past that's probably a positive now, which is the density. New York is so much denser than any other city in this country. You've got 2 million people living in 25 square miles roughly. A great stat, Manhattan is smaller than Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I mean, think about that density. And that was a disadvantage in the early generations of the tech industry because you needed big plants and the like, but it is probably a competitive advantage now. Google spent $1.9 billion on its New York headquarters, and a few weeks ago announced that it's taking a lot more square footage. So that ecosystem is really developing of managerial sales and marketing, as Kate alluded to, and I'm very, very bullish. And there's certainly plenty of capital there looking for places to deploy. And the tax rates are actually, even with Manhattan, a little less than California. Can't beat Texas, but hard to believe, but it's actually better in Manhattan than income taxes
I'd
than California.
add to the thing about New York, and this is the point out that you made, it's sort of horses for courses. I mean, Tumblr, by the way, is an excellent outcome, and probably the first big win in New York that everybody really applauded. Everyday Health is something a company we've been involved with that went public earlier this year. We're thrilled about the success, born around a kitchen sink in Brooklyn.
Shutterstock.
Shutterstock. I mean,
$3
there's
billion
really been
market
some
cap.
great companies so far, and many that are pending. The thing that's great when you look at New York is what are one of the strengths there? Media, content, those kinds of things. There's been a real focus around those skill sets. So drawing from that local skill set has really engendered a lot of very interesting companies around the core strengths that already existed in that space and the networks that had developed over time in that whole media content space. So that's typically then what you see, and I think it's what you see, you referred to, Eric, about clean tech in the middle of the country. St. Louis is a great place for ag tech for obvious reasons that Monsanto's there, right?
Absolutely. You know, Kate, and part of this, I think, is centered around something much more softer and ephemeral, and that is the culture of an area. The ability of entrepreneurs, immigrants from other states or from other countries to be able to go into a new ecosystem where the barriers to entry are low, where people are solicitous of having working side by side with them, hearing about their ideas, and then figuring out how that could be a potentially a profitable business. I was talking to a gentleman who was from sub-Saharan Africa, who, as a young person, moved to Canada and lived with a Japanese family, and then decided that it was too cold, although he learned how to ski. Started to drive down the highways in the U.S. with his wife until they could find a place that they liked, and they wound up in Denver for some reason. Okay, so it looked like a little bit like Calgary, where he was outside of. So you match up someone who can take that seamless, aggressive ability to move into any landscape on any continent. Then you match that with that person's desire to want to start a business, and if there are low barriers to entry, access to capital, if there are the right kind of resources, that person becomes another potential entrepreneur. And while that business may not scale up to the point of Facebook or Google, they can be very successful. And that's the kind of situation that I saw when I was in Texas, especially in Austin, but also in Houston and Dallas, where there's a lower barrier to entry. They have some other structural issues that make it really easy to kind of move into the ecosystem and then grow your business. And I think those areas that have that kind of a culture can be very enticing to the next generation of businesses that want to grow up.
Yeah, I think one other aspect of culture, I would term work ethic. You know, is it an area where there's an intensity and focus, and when you're 25 years old, a couple years out of college, are your friends focused on going out and partying at night, or going out and partying after they've been coding till midnight for just a few hours there, and then heading back to work? This is in New York. We were talking a moment ago. Certainly in the financial industry, there's a tremendous culture of crazy hours and intensity. And in fact, Paul Mader, who succeeded Kate by a year or two at the National Venture Capital Association, has spoken here in the past. He has a whole theory about what really got New York going over the last couple of years was all the people who came to the financial industry from college in '07 or '08 who got laid off
Yeah.
and didn't want to leave New York, but they wanted to work hard, and they found themselves through entrepreneurial types of ventures. You know, we talk about the I think lifestyle came up earlier, and I know Colorado, cheers, has a tremendous lifestyle, and that's probably one of the competitive advantages. Healthiest state in the country, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But lifestyle can be too good, too. You know, we used to have a saying at my firm: "Be careful about working with firms in South Florida." Lifestyle's too good. Are people really going to have that work ethic?
Well, Canada then must be really good.
Or the Nordic, or the Nordic
Because
we stay
region.
there's no
inside.
reason to go
We
outside.
stay inside for the last 6 months anyway.
Spotify was formed during permanent darkness of the Nordic winter, right?
There we go.
You know what's fascinating about the comments? You know, there was a key theme of immigration. It's interesting that if only the U.S. federal government would actually understand the power of immigration, one of the things that Canada has done is use the U.S. against itself from an immigration
A
perspective.
lot of countries are.
And about a year or so ago, the Canadian federal government set up what's called a startup visa, and they put a billboard up at Highway 101. I had half a dozen VCs send me this photograph as they were driving, which I'm kind of wondering what they were doing. And it was usually titled, "What are you?"
We were in traffic. It was
Oh,
going
okay, that's
slow
right.
at the time.
They're kind of saying, well, "What are you bastards doing up there in Canada?" And one of the things that I don't know if any of the foreign affair folks are here. I know they're outside the door, but I actually said to them, "Put your billboard and put a booth right in MIT, Stanford, etc. And when the students who are graduating who want to build a company and they have to go back home, largely to Asian countries, just go up north a little bit. We're happy to take them." And it's just kind of interesting. One of our co-investor VCs in the U.S. had actually asked me just about an hour or two ago, could we do something to take advantage of your program there and build some cross-border companies so that we don't lose those people, and it'll be a competitive advantage. So it's just kind of fascinating that once the U.S. figures it out that this is the big advantage, I think it's going to continue to juice the great entrepreneurship in the U.S.
And I would say something else, John. I mean, the Canadians are fascinating and enjoyable to work with. So I sit on the board of directors of a clean tech incubator, and I'm a co-founder in a startup. And the Canadians, we're working closely with them to bring some of the best of their startups into the U.S. and they want to bring it through the incubator, clean tech incubator in Colorado. And there's a sense of the Canadians looking wherever the best conduit is, wherever the easiest partner is, the best markets. That's what they'll work with, and I think that's really important.
Well, it's
Since we
interesting
have
because you're touching on policy issues, and having spent time in Washington working on different things, I think there is definitely a role for government. I know that's one of the themes, you know, throughout the conference that we should touch on. I think one of the hottest issues. I was involved with the passage of the Jobs Act, and at the Rose Garden signing ceremony, somebody came up and said, "Okay, you know, what's the next thing?" And I said, "Far more passionate, you know, issue for people in Silicon Valley is immigration, even more than the chance to go public." And the idea that you look at a university like MIT and half of their graduate students are foreign-born, we are going to make them leave.
Right.
They're going to go to Canada. I mean,
Right.
Get your signs up. I think is absolutely crazy. But I think there are, you know, that's a good example of a role for companies. I know from talking to people from China, likewise, they're looking at this like Canada is, thinking this is a great opportunity to get the turtles to come back home, as they refer to them. So I think that's one thing. You know, government policy is making a big impact in immigration right now. Something people want to solve but haven't yet been able to. Let's hope post the midterms we can. Labor policies in Europe are a big issue. There are reasons that people will form companies are hesitant in Silicon Valley to form companies on the continent in particular because of labor policies. It's understandable why they're there, but it's also very difficult to have a fixed cost like that. That doesn't exist in places like Canada. I think cost of living is obviously a huge issue, and you know, Andrea referred to that, and that is obviously something that the government can play a role in. But I think there is, you know, people think, gosh, do we need you know, financial sponsorship from the government? No, not at all. But I think these kinds of policies can have a huge impact, and that's got to be a benefit right now to Canada.
Absolutely.
I was actually picking up on this. I was with a group at a White House meeting last week of primarily venture capitalists. Met with the Office of Science and Technology and also with one of the senior advisors in the White House. And there is a window on this immigration bill that the Senate passed that they're waiting on right after most of the Republican primaries are done. If John Boehner were to bring the Senate bill to the House, the bill that passed the Senate on immigration reform, it would pass the House. But there's too many of these Republican primaries where candidates on the far right, so-called Tea Party, are trying to unseat more traditional Republicans, that he doesn't want to do it then. So there is going to be this window after most of those primaries are done, this June or July. Lobby your representatives. It's not just good for the
I
tech
agree.
industry, it is good for this country.
Absolutely.
Every one of us is an immigrant.
Here, here.
Well, just taking a second on that, on slide 23, if you could pull this up, one of the things that we do at Cambridge Associates, we're a global investment advisory firm, and we track thousands of venture capital managers around the world, not just in the U.S. And what you're looking at here is a global return quilt. We call them quilts because they look like quilts. The performance of U.S. venture capital investments is the yellow box. So just let your eye drift across that quilt. You'll notice that it doesn't claim the top spot every year, and you're looking at 2002 through 2011. What you are looking at is that developed Europe's actually doing pretty well over the last couple of years, emerging Asia Pacific as well. Investors' dollars are global, and they don't have to only be in the U.S. in Silicon Valley firms. And if you look at, there's probably 12,000 individual venture capital investments represented on that slide somewhere. And that the performance of venture capital isn't necessarily dependent on any one region. And the other takeaway you would have from looking at this quilt is that all the horses are changing courses in every single year that you're looking at. So in any given year, you're going to have different regions around the world prevailing and being more successful than the others, and maybe taking that top spot or hanging out near the top for some period of time. And I know we're talking specifically about Silicon Valley, but investors are global in their thinking, and it shows in the performance that's been delivered over time. Just want to put that on the table for
I want
you.
to underscore
That's a really good
Andrew's
point.
point here. Could you bring back slide 18? And this was you saw earlier was the IPOs, and you see the East Asian point that Andrea is alluding to. WE is Western Europe, and EEMEA, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. But to further make this point, go to the next slide, number 19.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We've been talking about tech, media, telecom. This is the healthcare ecosystem. Very, very different picture. Here you see Southern California, probably more San Diego than the LA area. New England exceeding Silicon Valley. Israel, 6 IPOs alone from Israel in healthcare, really extraordinary. And it gets
per
this, the
capita price
ecosystem is just different in healthcare, and that's obviously healthcare being the second biggest recipient of venture capital after technology.
A good example of what a community can do is San Diego. San Diego, obviously great universities there as well. It's a bit denser than Los Angeles. We use that as an example. One of the things that a lot of the business community there and the university has sponsored is something called San Diego Connect. And if you don't know about it, look it up. Because it's a great example of how a community can build, can convene. And this is a role of, it could be policymakers, it could be universities, it could be business people, it could be all three in unison doing these kinds of things across the world to be successful. It's a great opportunity, and the idea is, as the name suggests, for connections to be made, connections for money, connection for ideas. I'm a scientist, I can meet you, the sales and marketing person. We can, my company might be able to do business with yours. It's a great opportunity, and people come from all over to the events that they have. They have a very active website. They really showcase the things that are coming out of the university. It really helps those sprouts that are coming out of the ground be successful. So those, I think, in terms of prescriptions, because it's always good to have solutions to some of these things, it's what makes some of them successful.
Yeah, actually, at the Institute, we did a study in San Diego around 2004, and we cited the Connect program as one of the most fundamental factor by stringing up different resources on the ground and what to make San Diego shine as a tech startup. We also, I think, critique along the way by saying that the spatial geography is somewhat limited, so it's difficult somewhat to have the tech startup to grow to a bigger sizes, meaning at some point either those companies will be purchased out or merge into other locations in the US. For that, can I have slide number 1, please? So since we're at, we bring the topic into from Silicon Valley into what government and immigration can do, and I thought that it's my obligation to also remind us that the government also tax us. So to round the story up, this is the role of the government in this process. I would like to bring the factor, I think, for any entrepreneur, taxation. So I would like to do a survey on all five of you on how critical and at what stage of investment that the tax rate is so influential that may make you change some of your thinking on the deal that you are making.
You got to start with Mr. Texas. Or
Yeah, I mean,
formerly in Texas.
we might take both sides of this one.
We
Yeah.
don't have
Start with
taxes. They don't have
You got to
tax.
start with Eric.
We don't even have
Okay.
taxes.
Got to start.
So I think it's a really a good question, complex question. So on the one hand, Texas has a very low regulatory burden and low and no state tax, income tax, and so that makes a favorable environment. On the other hand, a lot of the startups are starting in the most expensive city in which you want to live with the highest cost of living, and that's Austin. So relative to Houston or Dallas or San Antonio or El Paso, Austin has the highest cost of living. So there's some pieces there of having to build how to work down and be a little more granular in the analysis to figure out exactly what's going on there. I always thought having lived in Texas for over 40 years, it was more along the lines of, I have an idea, what do you think? And this guy says, well, I think Jimmy's daddy's got a little money. Only Jimmy daddy had a lot of money, and maybe that gets it off the ground. I graduated from the University of Texas, so there's a lot of sharp engineers and entrepreneurs coming out of those programs, both undergrad, graduate, and PhD program. So I think all those kind of pieces roll in there. My guess is it's an amalgam of all of those pieces that have moved the ball forward. One last thing, when I moved to Austin in the late 70s, early 80s, I never would have thought, none of us would have thought that Austin would be the #1 labor market in the United States. Austin was the redheaded stepchild of Texas. Houston had the big oil and gas money, and Dallas had the old money and the finance money. And Austin had good food, some swimming, and music. And so, I got to see I really got to see firsthand how that city grew up into the city in which we all know about now. And it's very intriguing. But I think it's all those pieces.
But I would argue, and I think that, and the question you asked, Perry, was really at what stage it matters. I have never met an entrepreneur who's starting a company that has cared about taxes because they don't pay them for years.
Yeah.
And they care more about cost of living, and they care more. The reason Austin is so attractive is because of the density, the ecosystem, that everyone is from somewhere else. Is it Austin is weird? What is the
what's keep Austin weird.
Keep Austin
Keep
weird.
Austin weird.
Okay, that idea that being an out-of-the-box thinker, the fact that South by Southwest that started really as a music festival now really has now morphed into also a very big tech centric kind of festival, I think is a lot of what attracts people to Austin. I do think, however, that companies care a lot when they get bigger. And the companies, Omniture was the company that I referred to in our portfolio that was so successful in Provo. ExactTarget was so successful in Indianapolis. Interesting, Adobe acquired Omniture. Salesforce has acquired ExactTarget. They plan, and they already have in Omniture because it's been a couple of years, to build out the portfolio in those areas for tax reasons, for stability of a workforce reasons, for cost of living, et cetera. They've been very impressed. So I think that there is a time when people care a lot about that, typically not at the genesis stage.
So Kate, I think that's a good point.
Go ahead.
Austin is now a place that in its own way mirrors a cost of living closer to Silicon Valley.
Save the taxes.
Save the taxes. However, what it does have that is quite similar is it now has an expanding pool of seasoned entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
And those seasoned entrepreneurs are accessible to Jane and Jim, who have a good idea, having just finished up their PhD program, and they can now match that with a seasoned CFO, CEO, CIO to help them move that through and actually help them access capital. That very much looks like Silicon Valley and some of the more mature places, I think.
I'm going to take issue a little bit with what Kate said. and not so much about absolute tax rates, but the differential between ordinary income and capital gains.
Yeah.
You know, you look
Well,
back
that makes a
historically, probably the most important piece of legislation to drive Silicon Valley in the 80s was the Steiger Amendment in '79, where the capital gains rate was cut in half. So you created this differential. And people talk about how in the late 70s, when ordinary income rates, the top marginal rate was 70%. So that's the time when Microsoft, Apple, Amgen, Oracle were all founded. So if you're a bright young person coming out of school or even middle-aged and you're saying, well, my W-2 income is taxed at what? And if I decide to be an entrepreneur down the road, what's that capital gains rate going to be? This is unfortunately an area where the tax changes at the end of 2012 narrowed the differential between ordinary income and capital gains. So again, back to public policy. You can argue where marginal rates should be, but I would contend that the delta between cap gains and ordinary income being broad is a very good stimulator of
Well, and it
entrepreneurial
matters both
activity.
to entrepreneurs and to the investors that
And
go
to the
into it. I
investors.
couldn't agree more. That's a federal policy, and yeah, I would agree.
And absent, and I agree with your comment on the corporate income taxes. We would love it if they're paying corporate income taxes, and as you know, it's just so long in the horizon that people don't really particularly care. But from a public policy perspective, some countries, and I'll use Canada as an example, has tax incentives irrespective of where you pay income tax. So the most popular one is the Canadian R&D tax credit. In the US, it largely is a credit against taxes otherwise payable. The problem in the tech sector is that there is no taxes payable. In Canada, it's actually a subsidy. So it's a refundable tax credit. And a lot of US VCs, I'm surprised how knowledgeable they are about it because it's non-dilutive financing. And up to $3 million of your activities, you get basically 65 cents back on the dollar, back in cash refund, which allows you to continue and to hire more folks, et cetera. That particular policy has been replicated around the world in a variety of countries to actually compete against Canada.
That does work.
And that actually is one that I've actually seen singly is one of the only circumstances of government intervention that has seemed to stimulate when companies need it most. You know, before they're getting their first round of financing, they're bootstrapping, and that's perhaps one great example.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyone want to comment?
I mean, at our shop, we're meeting with venture capital seed stage all the way up through the large cap buyout. And where we tend to see companies move their jurisdiction is either if they're doing a material add-on. You don't want to mess with the culture that you've built in the state or country where you've built it. And so you can't really force the home office to truly move unless there's a real drastic reason why that needs to happen. So typically we don't see a lot of buyout venture or growth equity managers force a change in company headquarters unless there's a really good reason. And if we do see it, it's usually when there's a control buyout. So for all the reasons why we're talking about it doesn't happen at the venture capital level, we're not seeing it so dramatically happening at other echelons of private capital, but we are seeing more of it, and actually more to Texas.
Yeah, Texas, Arizona, there are a couple places that have been, very successful.
Okay, I'm about to do another survey, and I sense that Silicon Valley is taking a beating. Everyone said that they can do it without the Valley.
Well, look at page 7.
That
Follow
upset
page
me
7.
and my colleague Ross over there, because we're the champion of the Valley. How often, I should rephrase it, do you guys really connect what you do back to Valley? At what level?
I can use, just looking at our portfolio, we've invested in 20 companies right now, all in Canada. 15 of the 20 are co-invested with Silicon Valley firms. And this is the issue about connectivity. It is important for the success of our Canadian companies to be connected in key U.S. cities in particular where their big markets are. And one of the great things for us to co-invest with U.S. VCs is that they have the networks that we can't be in front of a product manager of Google every day. They can walk in across the street. So what I think is the best combination is getting multiple networks around the world in different markets. And you end up with a combination of resources that are available to a company that are incredible. So for us, we do believe it's a key for success. You can't ignore it. my point really early on was you don't need to have the company based there. But I will tell you is that as our companies grow, we do find that a lot of our offices end up becoming, whether they're BD or sales offices or marketing, in New York, in Silicon Valley, in Boston, because that's where the people resources actually reside.
Kate, your
Yeah,
obvious.
I would agree. Well, I would agree, and I live in Silicon Valley. It is hyper-connected. I mean, you think about the crowd that's here at the Milken conference, and a lot of networking going on the halls. It's like this every day. You go in, I mean, I live in San Francisco. You go in a coffee house, and there's just laptops up, and people, doing this all the time. And it is interesting. It's a calling card for us. We like investing out of Silicon Valley, as we like investing in Silicon Valley. It's about half and half in our portfolio. And people are looking for that connectivity. I mean, the people that we know that are our neighbors, let alone who we've invested with and done business with. You look at our LinkedIn profiles across our firm, which is a small, relatively small venture capital firm. We touch almost every major.
Right.
We have people that are meaningful jobs at almost every tech company in the Valley that matters, large and small, and I think it is a benefit to people, and why it's a benefit for us to do deals with people like
Right.
you up in Canada to help bring that connectivity elsewhere.
Look, I think Silicon Valley is to tech what Houston is to energy, New York is to financial services, what Washington is to government, and more than anything, perhaps, it's where young people go who want to be in those industries.
Yes.
Now that can change, and you can have other areas. Seattle, Microsoft dramatically accelerated Seattle's position in the technology industry. So things can change, revolve over time, but I think that mecca, that drawing, is really the foundation.
As someone who is an investor in venture capital globally and locally, on slide 22, I'm going to give you one more quilt as to the importance of the West Coast from an investor's standpoint. And so absolutely appreciating that the bolus of venture capital that gets deployed in the U.S. is coming out of the West Coast. Another quilt for you, this is only U.S. venture-backed investments. You'll note that U.S. VCs do invest outside their country. That's the gray non-U.S. box that you can see. Keep your eye on the orange square. And the orange square is West Coast venture capital investment performance against the Southeast, Southwest, West Coast, Mid-Atlantic, New England, and Midwest. And what you see is that, yes, a lot of the capital is originating out of Silicon Valley. It is being deployed around the country, and the returns of West Coast-based venture capital-backed investments is good, but not necessarily, again, claiming the top spot every time. And from an investor standpoint, we're very interested in all the networks and all the interconnectivity that can really help a lot of these companies on a national basis. Having offices or sales offices or biz dev offices in Boston, New York, and other places, we've observed that returns come from everywhere. And certainly not shying away from wanting to know everybody in the Valley and having a lot of capital deployed against it. We are always reminded by looking at analysis like this that returns can come from all corners.
Well, some of what's going on is if you've got a tremendous amount of capital in the area and deals get bid up, returns
Better deals can be found elsewhere.
Right, returns
Yeah,
come
exactly.
down, deals
The
get bid up.
pricing is better,
Right.
more stable workforces. It's
Or
good
different
reason.
kind of deals. If we could go back to
Very
slide,
true. Very
to slide 10. So this is kind of keying off a conversation that Alec and I were having in the hallway. So there's certain kinds of innovation that are growing in areas. In Houston, and around the energy centers, which also includes Denver and some of the front range cities, there's a great deal of energy innovation taking place that's not taking place necessarily in Silicon Valley, nor would many of the Silicon Valley VCs that necessarily have grown up in that ecosystem and understand how to assist those companies. So I'm working with a group that's has a business in Houston. It started out in Langley, and there are a bunch of PhD aerospace scientists that can measure the gas plume, the constituencies of the gas plume that from space and from terrestrial bases that they can now deploy around natural gas and oil and gas production fields. And some of the oil and gas people are saying, wow, okay, this is really different, and we're going to put some money behind it. So there might be bioscience plays that are unique to a specific area. I do a lot of work with the National Renewable Energy Lab. That's in Golden, Colorado. There's certain innovation that the scientists originate there that is different from innovation centers in other places in the U.S. So I think what that means is that Silicon Valley is a unique and special place, high density capital and thought and entrepreneurial activity. But there are other places that are as unique. They're not even clones. They're just completely unique with their own ecosystems and their own kind of innovation and their needs for support and access to capital are different, where they can be very profitable and generate returns for investors that are quite profitable and enjoyable. And I think that's the a little more granular picture of how this builds out, at least in the U.S.
It's so true. I was in Austin last week, and I was chatting with a group about oil field services, technology-assisted services, and I said, "Wow, so you haven't invested in that space?" They're like, "Andrea, if an oil field services related deal comes to us in Austin, we shouldn't be doing it," is sort of what they said. And I was like, "You're not that far from the oil field."
Right, but it's a whole different culture and
yeah.
ecosystem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Actually, we only have a couple minutes left. Before I throw out the last question, and which is more like a more adventurous type, it's if you look at the past decades, a lot of innovation, a lot of venture deals are made in the space of electronics, ICT, and so whatnot, the digits, search, all software. But if we look forward into the future, we talk a lot in our conference about health, about life science, and now those species, if you will, are very different than electronics, than gadgets. And their investment cycle, capital requirements, regulatory regimes are totally different. So we talk a lot about the ecosystem that we know today. I would throw this out and say you guys can venture into this topic and see how you see the ecosystem will need to change to fit in, if you will, in the future requirements of innovations. And that's part one of the question. Part two would be, in 5 years' time, which region you see that would be the hotbed for innovation? All right. Should I start with Eric? Just make it very short. We only have a couple minutes.
I think for some medical devices and some biosciences and some clean tech, the Rocky Mountain region is going to be a critical area of innovation 36 to 60 months out.
I know, I'm thinking. I like Israeli for med tech and anything to do with visual. And then I think Ireland actually going way out for some life sciences innovation, things like that.
I like the Mid-Atlantic, which we haven't mentioned, as well as New England because of medtech and biotech and that whole ecosystem. What's underlied Silicon Valley in the industry for 50 years has been Moore's Law. The decline in costs on mapping individual genomes is a more powerful power curve than Moore's Law.
Yeah, and I'd say, particularly with respect to medtech, I mean, the challenge is you have a huge regulatory overlay here and confusion about our healthcare system. So I vote ex-US, and I think either Germany or Singapore are very interesting areas where there's a huge amount of technology, a lot of expertise in startups now. Their governments are doing different things to try to attract companies. France, to a lesser extent, are all, I think, interesting places that you might see some interesting growth over time.
And I would say if you broaden out healthcare into the broader sector of quality of food supply, pollution, China is going to be a place where they're going to be forced very, very quickly to deal with these issues. And it was the #1 request when we went out there to look for technologies to deal with it today. And I think that consumer-related investments around those particular areas are going to be massive there.
All right, so our panelists gave us, I think, full set of story, and I think at least at the end we proved that Silicon Valley is still the king of the king in terms of innovation. And please give aspiring panelists a round of applause.